Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the city bar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another podcast hosted by the City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies. Today, I am joined by four panelists who are also members of the task force. Each of them will introduce themselves immediately before they discuss issues related to President Trump's July 23rd, 2025 Artificial Intelligence Action Plan. My name is Jerome Walker. I am a co-chair of the task force. Today's podcast was focused on President Trump's July 2025 action plan titled Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan. The AI Action Plan is required by President Trump's January 23rd, 2025 executive order titled Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence. To give a sense of the goal of President Trump's action plan, I will quote some key excerpts from the action plan itself. Quote, "The United States is in a race to achieve global dominance in artificial intelligence. Whoever has the largest AI ecosystem will set global AI standards and reap broad economic and military benefits." Quote, "Winning the AI race will usher in new global age of human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security for the American people. The opportunity that stands before us is both inspiring and humbling, and it is ours to seize or to lose." Quote. So those quotes give you a sense of the importance President Trump is placing on this action plan. And it will also identify, as we get into the action steps, what the various challenges are and what the panelists think about this. Structurally, the action plan is easy to follow and is a relatively short, approximately short 24-page document divided into three parts or pillars. I've written hundreds of action plans in my career, including action plans covering artificial intelligence. And given the action steps and recommendations set forth in this action plan, I can safely assert that the length of the document is quite impressive compared with the length of action plans I have drafted or reviewed or that others are drafted. And that's actually a compliment, because to draft an action plan and to cover these many action steps and to do it in 24 pages is an enormous task for anybody. Typically, an action plan, many of them will have over 100 pages. And given how critically important this one is, someone really put a lot of thought into this plan. So let's dive into it. So pillar one is actually titled Accelerate AI Innovation. And that pillar asserts that America must have the most powerful AI system in the world, but we must also lead the world in creative and transformative application of these systems. Achieving these goals requires the federal government to create the conditions where private sector-led innovation can flourish. Now, pillar one is quite impressive compared to the other pillars in the sense that pillar one actually sets forth 15 action steps that are required. When we start to get into pillar one, we'll have Matt and Azish explain them. So I'm going to identify the 15 action steps, but the two of them will pick and choose the action steps that they believe are most important and that they would like to explain. So again, these are the 15 action steps. 1, remove red tape and onerous regulation. 2, ensure that frontier AI protects free speech and American values. 3, encourage open source and open weight AI. 4, enable AI adoption. 5, empower American workers in the age of AI. 6, support next generation manufacturing. 7, invest in AI-enabled science. 8, build world-class scientific data sets. 9, advance the science of AI. 10, invest in AI interpretability, control, and robust breakthroughs. 11, build an AI evaluations ecosystem. 12, accelerate AI adoption in government. 13, drive adoption of AI within the Department of Defense. 14, protect commercial and government AI innovations. And 15, combat synthetic media in the legal system. Pillar 2 is titled Build American AI Infrastructure and asserts that AI is the first digital service in modern life that challenges America to build vastly greater energy generation than we have today. American energy capacity has stagnated since the 70s, while China has rapidly built out their grid. America's path to AI dominance depends on changing this troubling trend. Now we will hear from Robert, who will identify a number of the action steps he will discuss. Unlike Pillar 1, which had 15 action steps, Pillar 2 only has 8 action steps. And those 8 are: number 1, create streamline permitting for data centers, semiconductor manufacturing facilities, and energy infrastructure while guaranteeing security. 2, develop a grid to match the pace of AI innovation. 3, restore American semiconductor manufacturing. 4, build high security data centers for military and intelligence community usage. 5, train a skilled workforce for AI infrastructure. 6, bolster critical infrastructure cybersecurity. 7, promote secure by design AI technologies and applications. And 8, promote mature federal capacity for AI incident response. Pillar 3 is titled Lead in International AI Diplomacy and Security, and it asserts that to succeed in the global AI competition, America must do more than promote AI within its own borders. The United States must also drive adoption of American AI systems, computing hardware, and standards throughout the world. America currently is the global leader on data center construction, computing hardware performance, and models. It is imperative that the United States leverage this advantage into an enduring global alliance while preventing our adversaries from free riding on our innovation and investment. Evan will focus on Pillar 3. Pillar 3 has only 7 action steps, and those 7 are: 1, export American AI to allies and partners. 2, counter Chinese influence in international governance bodies. 3, strengthen AI compute export control enforcement. 4, plug loopholes in existing semiconductor manufacturing export controls. 5, align protection measures globally. 6, ensure that the U.S. government is at the forefront of evaluating national security risk in frontier models. And 7, invest in biosecurity. That is a lot to take in. And so, again, I am very pleased that we have our experts to help everyone understand the action plan. So, again, I'm very pleased to introduce task force members with extensive knowledge and experience on a wide range of AI issues, including working with President Biden's executive order on AI, President Trump's executive order on AI, and President Trump's action plan. These task force members are thought leaders and represent stakeholders across the spectrum. Our panelists in alphabetical order by last name include Evan Abrams, who is a partner at Steptoe; Matthew Bacal, who is a partner at Davis Polk; Azish Filabi, who is a professor and the executive director of American College Carrie McGuire Center for Ethics in Financial Services, and Robert Mahari, who is an associate director at Codex, which is the Stanford University Center for Legal Informatics. So let's get started. Matt and Azish, would you please introduce yourselves and your practice areas?
Sure. Thanks, Jerome. Well, my name is Matt Bacal. I'm a partner at Polk in the IP and commercial transactions practice, and I oversee our AI practice.
Thanks, Jerome. I'm Azish Filabi. As you mentioned, I'm managing director of the Center for Ethics in Financial Services as part of the American College of Financial Services, where I'm also a professor of business ethics. In addition to a responsible AI program, we focus on trust in financial services and broader business ethics issues with respect to stakeholders.
All right. So, Matt, your firm actually published a separate client update on each of the three pillars of the action plan. So I know that you're familiar with all three of the pillars, but I want you first and then Azish to focus in on pillar one. So, Matt, first with you and then Azish, would you please provide an overview of some of the action steps in pillar one? And Matt and Azish, you can pick and choose the ones that you identify and that you explain. Starting with you, Matt, please.
Sure. Thanks, Jerome. I'm going to take about half of them, but I think group them somewhat thematically, and then I'll turn over to Azish to cover some of the other ones. So I think there's a reason why they started off the pillar one action plan with remove red tape and onerous regulation. Overall, I'd say the main thrust of pillar one is sort of deregulatory in nature, although I'll get to some of the areas where there may be some additional regulation. But the first part of pillar one has a number of directives to reduce regulation, anything that would hinder AI innovation by the private sector. So here, a few examples are the action plan directs the Office of Science and Technology Policy to seek public feedback about current federal regulations that hinder AI innovation. Similarly, it directs OMB to work with federal agencies to do the same and seek to reduce agency rules and regulations that hinder AI innovation where appropriate. It also directs the FTC to review open investigations and existing final orders, consent decrees, and injunctions that may unduly burden AI development. And similarly, directs the FCC to take a look at state laws where the FCC may find those in conflict with the Trump administration's approach to AI deregulation. The other thing I think is noteworthy is the plan also directs OMB to take a look at state laws that may be overly burdensome on AI regulation on the private sector and seek to direct federal funds away from those states and towards states that are more friendly towards AI innovation. And so we'll have to see how these are implemented in practice and whether that impacts the way states are thinking about their own AI regulatory process. And the counterpoint to this is that while this is largely, the overarching theme is deregulation, the plan also identifies some potential areas for AI regulation and previews likely government oversight themes, such as ensuring that American AI is free from ideological bias and social engineering. The action plan also expresses concern about things like the prevalence of synthetic media and corresponding risks to the U.S. legal system. And so while overall Pillar 1 has a deregulatory thrust, there are certain areas that the administration has expressed concern about where there may be opportunity for certain targeted additional regulation. The last area I'll focus on, and I'll turn over to Azish, I know there's a lot to cover across these three pillars, are sort of areas of additional investment and sort of democratization of access to AI. So, for example, the plan wants to encourage access to large-scale computing power for startups and academics. The plan also encourages stakeholders to develop open source and open weight models that small and medium-sized businesses can more easily adopt. And the plan also has one section focusing on the retooling of American workers in the age of AI to ensure that the American workforce is prepared and where AI may be disruptive to certain industries or certain types of jobs within industries, that American workers are upskilled to be able to participate in the new AI economy.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. I'm also going to organize my comments thematically in terms of the pillars that I'll be speaking about, or the action items under this pillar. The development of the science of AI is a major emphasis of Pillar 1. And there are three themes that jump out at me relating to that scientific development process. Is the first one is that there is a emphasis on public-private collaboration. And that emphasis, I think, is echoed in action items like investing in automated cloud-enabled labs that could be built by the private sector or by federal agencies or research institutions, depending on where the strengths lie, and a focus on long-term agreements. In addition, there's opportunities for encouraging AI use and testing through pilot programs and sandboxes, which inherently requires this public-private sector collaboration in order to make that effective. So that's one theme from those action items that jump out. The second is that there is an emphasis on shared use. And as Matt mentioned, emphasis on open source and open access. The action plan requires that agencies give incentives to researchers to release high-quality data sets publicly, and it requires disclosure of non-sensitive data sets and establishing protocols for controlled access even to restricted federal data for AI and use development. So really getting to the heart of scientific challenges with respect to particularly some of these large language models. And if we've reached the limits of data access, this is a way to be able to fundamentally advance the science of AI. And that indeed is the third focus and theme that's jumped out at me, which is this focus on fundamentals for long-term AI development and the role of the government in enabling that by requiring agencies to establish some minimum data quality standards for model training, and investing in AI interpretability and robustness to adversarial effects, which basically aims at the development of the science of breaking down these black box systems and having the advanced models be more explainable so they could be more practical in more sensitive use cases. And the last thing I'll mention on the fundamentals is that there's this emphasis on supporting the science and development of AI evaluations. In other words, how do we know if an AI system is high quality? The standards and expectations that would be required for those types of assessments, they're laid out within the plan so that those standards can be developed for performance and reliability of AI systems to be assessed. The other category that is embedded in Pillar 1 is with respect to AI adoption by the government itself, and in particular, an emphasis on the Defense Department adopting AI. And here also there's this emphasis on uniformity and standards. For example, an AI procurement toolbox to allow any federal agency to easily choose among multiple models that would be compliant for law within the legal framework that they are operating. So my overall impression is that I'm encouraged by this emphasis on collaboration and openness, and it leads to broader questions, which Jerome, I know we'll talk about later in the podcast, in terms of, from my perspective, for this collaboration and openness to work, you need high trust people and institutions to be able to work together, and finding those pathways for trust and trustworthiness and leadership and making sure that the right people have the right stakeholder engagement mindset at play would be really important for the action plan to be effective.
Yeah, so Matt and Azish, that was a lot for the audience to take in. And so, Azish, you started down this road, so I'm going to ask you and Matt to continue. Could you now give some takeaways? In other words, if you are a company or even a governmental agency or a nonprofit that's out there, or an academic even that's out there that's saying, okay, here's this action plan and I've read it so I understand it. What are the takeaways? What should I glom on to and start to take action about? Azish, you can go first, or Matt, you can go. You guys can decide, but please focus on the takeaways, the key takeaways for the audience. Matt, you'll start then.
Okay, sure, no problem. Thanks, Jerome. So I guess for businesses, there's a few takeaways that come to mind. The first is that federal agencies are going to seek comment on and may actively initiate modifications to certain regulations that might restrict AI development. I think even though that's the direction, the timeline for implementation is unclear. I think businesses will still want to move kind of cautiously, because to the extent that they've set up a more robust compliance program, I probably wouldn't rush to modify that compliance program. It may be harder to, if you take down some of your internal compliance infrastructure, anticipating a loosening of regulations, but depending on where those things actually go, it may be harder to reestablish those compliance protocols and procedures. So I would move, I think, a little bit cautiously. The plan is one thing, the actual implementation is another. I think you'll need to wait and see where it actually goes. The other thing I would think about is that as the plan kind of sets out, I think we'll get to this in some of the other pillars, but the federal government is increasingly looking at data and technology as a national security issue. And so I think in order to mitigate risk, businesses should also be taking that sort of into account if they're working heavily in these areas, ensuring that they're conducting sort of adequate risk assessments and taking into account the national security implications of technology they may be using or developing, including to the extent they're relying on part of their tech stack from service providers based in foreign countries, having an eye to the fact that there may be increased regulation in that regard. And they may want to start to think about sort of future-proofing their supply chain that way.
So Azish, in addition to the stakeholders that Matt was talking about, what about technologists? What about consumers? What about governmental entities, not-for-profits? All of us are going to be affected by this. What are your takeaways to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the financial sector, which is an area that I focus on as one stakeholder. And just to echo Matt's comments in terms of compliance systems and protocols, the financial regulators will continue regulating under existing law how AI is used. So that's not impacted by this action plan. So just keeping in mind that long-term investment in governance and compliance needs to remain and become even more robust as the technologies continue to improve. The other aspect of this public-private collaboration, from a technologist perspective, from an academic's perspective, there are new opportunities. So being able to connect with these government pilot programs and being able to interact within your space around use cases that you would like to see tested. We're in this long arc of a technology life cycle, and we don't exactly know where we are in that arc. So what we know is that some of the early investments in technology use cases through LLMs have actually failed from an enterprise perspective. But now there's this opportunity, especially with the government investment in long-term fundamentals of AI, for companies to start to think long-term as well in terms of what's the purpose of the use, and then working backwards from that, what kind of technology development can help align with that purpose. So thinking more strategically and seeing the strategy as it laid out in the action plan. From a civil society perspective, I think that there's a lot missing within the action plan if you think about the rights-based framework that the last administration had been focusing on. So if I were a nonprofit leader, a civil society leader, thinking about the risks to my communities, how can I now take this questions relating to, let's just choose confidentiality and privacy as a realm? That's not emphasized within the action plan. So now the onus is on civil society to be very clear and specific around their needs and how they want to interact with the technology that is being developed and how to find new pathways for advocacy relating to their constituencies.
So starting with Matt and then back to Azish, if you were looking at all 15 of the action steps, have you reached a conclusion regarding some being more important than others? Or should stakeholders look at all of them as the same? I think, Matt, you kind of tipped your hand earlier in terms of the way that you started out, which suggested that at least some of them probably would come into being before others, but help stakeholders that figure out, again, of the 15, are there some more important than others? Or would you say all 15 are equally important in terms of how they should play out? Are some sequentially going to go before others? How are you thinking about that, Matt?
Well, I think it's hard to say that any are sort of qualitatively more important than others in a certain respect. But, I think the ones that will impact impact businesses the most are, as first and foremost, the deregulatory effort, depending on where it goes. I mean, again, all of this depends on the implementation. So some of these pillars may be implemented robustly at the end of the day, others may not. And I think that's really the thing for businesses to keep an eye on. But I think people will be anticipating a lighter touch from the federal government, and then we'll have to see the extent to which that impacts state governments as well. But I think given the clear identification of AI as both an economic and national security priority, I do think that this will probably free the development of AI in the US from some of the more onerous regulation that we may see in other parts of the world.
Azish, how do you think about it?
I largely agree. I think that in terms of sequence, what likely will play out, hard to predict, but there's this emphasis on the fundamentals as one of the themes that I highlighted earlier. And for the use case adoption and implementation to be effective, the emphasis on the fundamentals is really where the implementation would likely begin, right? So I think logically that's probably a way that we'll see some of this sequencing play out, where we really need to get the science of the technology enabled in order to then have the implementation be effective within government agencies or within some of these sandboxes. But within our broader economic systems, one of the outcomes that's highlighted as a clear policy goal is competitiveness. And so that'll, I think, be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of access to data. Despite the emphasis on the openness of access, there are larger tech companies that already have access to vast troves of data. And so how do we think about the role of the government in helping level out that playing field? Because the competitiveness is one of their goals, yet we don't necessarily see that articulated within the action plan. So I think there's going to be this market-based infrastructure that's going to be interacting with the aspirations of the action plan that is a little bit unpredictable, at least in my mind, to try to understand how that might play out.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think competitiveness globally is a less nuanced issue, right? Clearly, the goal is for the U.S. to sort of win the AI revolution, but competitiveness domestically among stakeholders of varying sizes is a trickier issue, and one the administration is going to have to work hard to balance correctly if they want to make sure that access to AI and use of AI is democratized, but also without harming some of the larger stakeholders who are going to be driving a lot of the innovation.
Thanks, Azish. Thanks, Matt. Now we're going to turn to Robert. Robert, would you please introduce yourself and your areas of practice?
Absolutely. My name is Robert Mahari. I'm the Associate Director of the Stanford Codex Center, which is a research center that sits between Stanford Law School and the Stanford Computer Science Department. And my focus is really on two things. On the one hand, to build artificial intelligence tools that support legal practice, really broadly defined, from helping lawyers to judges to individuals with kind of access to justice issues. And on the other hand, thinking about AI regulation, especially kind of technology-enabled AI regulation, as we're seeing more and more organizations use AI and the kind of scale of AI compliance becoming more and more complex. So yeah, happy to be here and talk about some of these topics.
Okay, so Robert, at the end, I'm going to give you a chance to comment on Pillar 1, but for now, could you focus on Pillar 2? As I said before, unlike Pillar 1, where Matt and Azish had to go through 15 separate action steps, you get a break. You only have to cover 8 action steps. So could you pick the 8, the sum of, or all, depending on how you feel about it? Could you identify and explain some of the key action steps in Pillar 2?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to, for the benefit of our listeners, group these things together in a way that makes sense, at least in my mind. And as a bit of background, I mean, maybe at this point, it kind of goes without saying, but when people hear about artificial intelligence, they assume that something digital is going on, right? Like people are developing code and algorithms. We all know data is involved. But really, like the process by which we train artificial intelligence models, this kind of iterative process of training these very large computational architectures, turns out to consume a massive amount of energy and requires these very sophisticated hardware components. And really, pillar 2 is about this angle, not so much the digital angle of AI, but the physical angle. So power plants, chip fabs, water for cooling, all the skilled workers who are going to maintain this infrastructure. And so the plan focuses, in my mind, on 5 core components. Some of these are legal, right? So speeding up the permitting for data centers and semiconductor facilities. Others are more engineering based, so modernizing the power grid, restoring American chip building capabilities, building secure data centers. There's quite an emphasis on cybersecurity, training the workforce. All of these components are then required to actually be able to build the physical infrastructure that we need, or at least that the plan anticipates that we'll need in order to propel AI forward. And so I think what strikes me as challenging, and I admit that I'm not an energy infrastructure expert by any means, but what's challenging here is really the interconnectedness, right? So this is an energy grid that exists for something and was built for something that has nothing to do with AI. AI is kind of interesting when it comes to energy because for 2 reasons, right? One is you can put there are 2 parts of AI that are costly in terms of energy. There's training the models, which is mostly a one-off exercise. And then there's inference, right? The ongoing usage of these models. You can time the training to be at off-peak hours and things like that. And you can put the infrastructure close to your power, right? So unlike other types of industry where you are limited by where the resources are or where the labor is and things like that, you have some mobility here. At the same time, you have to consider the kind of trickle-down downstream effects of suddenly ramping up your energy consumption. So Jerome, let me know, do you want me to kind of start digging into these components in a bit more detail, or should I hand it back to you?
No, go right into it, because I
right.
think the audience needs you to explain. I'm learning a lot. I read it. I didn't understand it the way you understand it. So clearly this is helpful. So please continue.
Okay, absolutely. So I think focusing on a couple of different key components here is helpful. So I'll kind of step through them, starting with data centers and manufacturing. And there, the emphasis seems to be really on permitting, not on technology, right? That we make it easier to build these data centers where all of the data that goes into AI can be stored, and presumably where all of the training is going to take place. And so there's talk about access to federal land where these facilities can be placed. And then there's talk about security safeguards to make sure that we can keep these facilities safe from adversarial attack. And then finally, and this is going to be kind of a theme in a couple places, there's an emphasis on semiconductors, right? So semiconductors and the manufacturing of GPUs, which is the kind of core technology that we're concerned with, is one extremely complex, right? So we're literally talking about manufacturing things at nanoscales, these like very complex devices. Relatively few organizations in the world have figured out how to do this. And for the most part, in the United States, we are not really in a place where we're producing a lot of semiconductors. And so as a result, we're reliant on foreign chips. And as you might imagine, the action plan kind of foresees this as being an issue. And again, there's this emphasis not just on the technical upskilling, which will come in a moment, but also on the more kind of regulatory removal of red tape, trying to make it as easy as possible to remove bottlenecks that are related to compliance and policy. And you might worry, right, about all of the kind of complexities and downstream effects of doing that. Like on the one hand, the kind of mundane, well, we'll just find federal land to put these data centers on, data centers that, by the way, consume massive amounts of water in order to cool them. This is like the key. You'll hear about the water consumption with AI that comes from cooling. And so you might worry that depending on where you place these facilities, there's going to be a water issue. And then, of course, removing red tape when it comes to manufacturing these extremely complex devices could also have unintended consequences. There are all sorts of caustic chemicals that are used in the processes. So there's like environmental concerns, et cetera. Second, there's this kind of energy question. And so on the energy strategy, the way I understood it is there's kind of a 3-part strategy for how we're going to improve the energy infrastructure. Again, energy is needed to maintain the training and then the inference of these models. So one is stabilizing the existing grid, preventing premature closure of plants, leveraging backup power, things like that, optimizing existing resources. So essentially making sure that what we have works as well as possible, making sure that we're as efficient as with what we have as possible, and then finally growing for the future. And so thinking about things like nuclear, geothermal, and fusion power as kind of new energy sources. And so I admit there are many people out there who understand electric grids much better. In fact, I don't know, for full disclosure, my wife works in a semiconductor company. And so I had the opportunity to chat with her about this and get some notes. And there are some interesting things that happen when you kind of emphasize this approach to building energy infrastructure, which is that you are going to keep existing energy facilities online longer than perhaps ideal, rather than focusing on shifting to more efficient, cleaner, more renewable, whatever energy modes. You're going to keep the things that we have online now going for as long as possible. And there might be unintended consequences or challenges with that. And it's interesting, I don't know how many of the listeners have noticed this, but kind of globally, well before this action plan, there's this renewed energy interest around nuclear power, which is interesting in and of itself. But what you need to consider with all of these is like power plants are enormously complex in and of themselves. And so it's not the question of like, oh, well, we'll just like get some more power plants going. Like you need workers for the power plants, you need resources for the power plants. If you want to use solar, you need silicon for the solar. So it's like the scale of this is really huge and the complexity is really huge. And I will say unintended consequences at least 10 more times before I get to the end of my remarks. Then we have critical infrastructure security, right? So there are all sorts of opportunities when you're building these very large facilities. It's not like you can hide them. So we need to think carefully about new vulnerabilities, both kind of like hardware vulnerabilities, right? Like you can unplug the data center, lose the data, things like that, to software cybersecurity vulnerabilities, including some interesting new ways of doing cybercrime that are enabled with AI. And so one of the things that the plan emphasizes is the security by design idea, right? So like, how do we design all of these systems, including the software systems, to be resilient to adversarial attacks, data poisoning? So data poisoning, by way of an example, this is maybe like a little bit deep, but if somebody was able to obtain access to a widely used training data set and then add all sorts of nonsense information, or for example, edit the US Constitution and just put hundreds of millions of copies of an edited version of the US Constitution into a data set such that these probabilistic models then have the wrong idea about what the Constitution says, right? Because at the end of the day, they're just going to learn probabilistic patterns. So you have this idea of data poisoning. You could also go after an individual. That's much easier, right? So like essentially you mischaracterize a certain person in the data, and given the like vast scale of these data sets, it's relatively easy for things to slip in. So there are all sorts of cybersecurity concerns. And then finally, we have the workforce training aspect. And this really like scales, right? So like when we think about AI, we maybe think of people like me who went and got a PhD and who are doing all this academic stuff. But really, there's a huge number of people that we need, from electricians and HVAC technicians and construction workers up to these very experienced and actually quite sophisticated roles in semiconductor manufacturing that we really don't have a lot of in the United States. And we need to upskill all of these people, right? Like we need to have new opportunities for training them. And the action plan kind of hints at things like apprenticeships and workforce programs and hands-on learning pipelines, all sorts of ways of making sure that the presumably tens of thousands of people that are needed to drive this really ambitious pillar are going to be there. And so to kind of wrap up this monologue, which I hope was interesting, and Jerome, feel free to ask questions. The pillar kind of starts by emphasizing China as a competitor here. And I think that it's worth kind of returning to this and thinking about the fact that in general, we might have a harder time moving really quickly when it comes to these massive kinds of projects. And so I think that like there's this sub theme within Pillar 2 about trying to figure out how we can accelerate these very large infrastructure projects through upskilling and removal of red tape and things like that. And I think leading up to this podcast, you had asked us to kind of rank in order of importance the various components. And so I've done my best, not that this is an easy thing to do, but it seems like the energy is kind of a non-negotiable, right? Like the energy needs are going to go up. I think related to energy is water consumption, which doesn't feature as prominently in the pillar, but is certainly something to consider. Then come semiconductors and the data centers that are going to house this infrastructure. These are things that in theory don't need to be in the United States, but of course there are various geopolitical and other reasons why we would want to have them. If you want to have semiconductors produced in the United States and data centers sitting in the United States, then you need a workforce to be able to support them. And at that point, you then also need cybersecurity, which we'll need anyway. But as we do more and more of this domestically, I think the opportunities for cybercrime really ratchet up beyond just the already ample opportunities for cybercrime that are just enabled through AI writ large. So I'll leave it there. I hope that was interesting.
Excellent. So when you started off your introduction, you appropriately indicated that two of the stakeholders that you pay especially close attention to is lawyers, because you're trying to help, and you've been doing it now for quite some time, trying to help essentially bridge two groups. And the groups are lawyers and engineers who are engaging in AI innovation. And you've been trying to help advance the knowledge of those two groups. You've also looked at the judicial system and judges and how they're trying to understand. So if you were talking to those stakeholders in particular, on the basis of what you just explained, what would you say to them are the key takeaways? What is it that you want them to know about with respect to Pillar 2? But if you want to combine Pillar 1 with Pillar 2, because that is likely to make it easier for lawyers, because I want to tell you, and maybe it's just me, but I have a high degree of understanding of Pillar 1, but Pillar 2 was a bit much for me because I don't have the technical knowledge that you have. And even you are saying, hey, wait a minute, there's even more technical stuff that's out there. So what would be your key takeaways to those stakeholders?
So I'll try to focus on Pillar 2 simply because Pillar 1 is genuinely, I mean, we just heard earlier, it's a huge can of worms, right? And I think we could have a whole podcast on open source and open weight models, whether those are a good thing or not. And it's really not a black and white type thing. So bringing this back to Pillar 2, it feels a little bit like we are about to enter the space age, and you're asking me, well, what is the role of lawyers in going to the moon? And initially people will say, like, oh, there's no role, right? Like, stay out of the way. But of course, that's not true, right? So for the kind of lawyers and engineers, on the one hand, I think there's a desire, an unmistakable desire in this act to remove red tape. And I think there are two ways that you can approach this. You can just shred the red tape, ignore it, or you can find more effective ways to navigate the policies that are presumably in place for reasonable purposes, right? Like there's a reason they're there. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. And I think that this will be another opportunity for legal technology to help people navigate policies and compliance more effectively and more quickly. And so I expect that if there are innovators out there listening to this, they should be thinking about like, well, what are the various, I'm sure, very complex things that are in the way of someone, say, opening a new data center or opening a new power plant? And is there anything that I can do to build a technology that helps them navigate this more quickly? For the judges, I mean, there's undoubtedly going to be a slew of litigation around every single aspect of this. And we talked about trade-offs and unintended consequences. And while I'm clearly an optimist when it comes to AI, and I think it's going to do great things, and I also think that by and large, I think it's a good thing for AI to be developed in nations that share the same kind of cultural and philosophical values as I do. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just how I feel. So I'm happy that we're taking this seriously. By the way, I know this is not what it's about, but in stark contrast to Europe, which is kind of taking a back seat to AI, but there will be unintended consequences. There will be trade-offs. And I expect that judges will be making hard decisions about how to balance these various interests, right? And when does it make sense to deprive a community of water in order to cool a data center? Is there any situation like how do we navigate this? And I think there'll be some really interesting and complex ethical choices. And I suspect, like, because of the flexibility that this technology affords us, it's not like we have to have the data centers by the coast or close to populated centers. There will likely be good solutions. Like we have a lot of latitude in terms of where we place these things. They might just not be that easy and convenient. And so I think that nudging, while innovation is good and having high pace here is good, nudging of folks, innovators, to not necessarily do the easiest thing, but something that is more sustainable and has less negative externalities is likely ultimately going to be the better thing. And I expect that this will reach the courts very shortly in some capacity. It's hard to anticipate.
Thanks, Robert. Evan, would you please introduce yourself and your area of practice?
Sure. Thanks, Jerome, and thanks for having me here. Evan Abrams, I'm a partner at the law firm Steptoe, LLP, based in Washington, D.C. And my practice really focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and various national security laws, helping companies understand and comply with and navigate the complex maze of national security-related rules that can apply to emerging technology, and in particular, artificial intelligence.
So, Evan, like with Matt and Azish and Robert, with respect to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, would you please provide an overview of some of the action steps in Pillar 3?
Sure. I think conceptually a good way to think about Pillar 3 is that it is dealing with kind of a fundamental tension of wanting to ensure that U.S. industry is supported and ensure that U.S. industry can engage in business activities around the world, both from a general economic and business perspective, as well as from a national security perspective, a desire that the world is running on U.S. AI technology that's built with AI or U.S. values and U.S. governance and security. So we have that from, on the one hand, that desire, and then that is being balanced against or somewhat in tension with the desire to prevent U.S. adversaries from gaining access to kind of the most cutting edge technology that we have, or using U.S. technology in ways that are going to be harmful to U.S. national security. And those two things are in somewhat in tension throughout Pillar 3 and the document as a whole. You see how the administration is trying to kind of thread that needle. I think a good example of that is the export control space, where there is recommendations or language in the action plan focused on enhancing enforcement of U.S. export controls, rolling out new U.S. export controls in certain instances. At the same time, there's a recommendation for the creation of a new program to support the export of what they call full stack AI technology, where different consortia of U.S. companies will actually go to the Commerce Department and submit proposals, and winning proposals will be supported by the government with respect to trying to find export markets. So that's a very clear example, I think, of that tension of wanting to be forward-leaning and support industry and have U.S. AI technology being used broadly, but also wanting to have appropriate controls in place. And we see that in a number of other places in Pillar 3 as well. There's a lot of discussion about evaluations of frontier AI models, as well as evaluations of potential risks posed by the use of AI in the United States developed by foreign adversaries. But what you don't see is, for example, a requirement that models are vetted or pre-approved by the government before launch. So we have this focus on evaluation, but in a somewhat kind of lighter touch manner. Similarly, there's an interesting discussion of involvement in international bodies where the U.S. is intending to participate in those international bodies as they discuss AI, but is doing so not so much from a perspective of wanting to kind of push a U.S. agenda of new international standards, but principally from a desire to counter the influence of China in these various international bodies. So you see that kind of tension throughout a number of places in Pillar 3. I think the last point I would make, just in terms of kind of how to think about the pillar conceptually and how to think about national security and AI security conceptually, is that while it is principally contained in Pillar 3, it does flow over in significant part to Pillars 1 and Pillars 2. And those national security issues really flow kind of throughout the document. So we heard already a little bit about cybersecurity, security for data centers, a variety of other measures that touch on U.S. national security that are kind of sprinkled throughout, even though I think Pillar 3 is certainly the locus of all of that. You get a flavor of that kind of throughout the document.
Yeah. So Evan, for the audience, when you're dealing with Pillar 3, especially with the national security issues and the export controls in particular, it's somewhat difficult to rank the order of importance. So if you were talking to stakeholders who were looking at Pillar 3, particularly because national security itself is such a broad area that ideally covers U.S. interests around the globe, and there are specific export positions that are taken on export controls. So could you rank them in order of importance or sequentially in terms of how this should be implemented so that stakeholders will get a sense of what the priorities are with respect to Pillar 3?
Sure. And I think you make a great point, Jerome, in the breadth of national security. And I think the breadth of how the U.S. government conceives of national security is surprising to some folks, particularly folks in other countries where the concept of national security is just a little bit narrower. So if you talk to folks in the European Union, for example, and you're having a conversation about national security, you're sometimes kind of missing each other because there's a slightly different conception. And in the US, it is very broad. In terms of how to kind of rank and think through the important pieces of Pillar 3, I would say it really depends on what industry you're in and where, I guess, what kind of sub part of the AI industry you're in. Obviously, the AI industry as a whole is who's impacted here. But are you building a data center? Are you in the semiconductor design or fabrication business? Are you building a foundation model? Are you fine tuning a model? That's really going to matter in terms of what the important pieces are. So if you're in the semiconductor space, I think it's the export controls. And in particular, language around increasing enforcement of existing export controls, of new controls, particularly for different parts and components that go into semiconductor manufacturing equipment. That's probably the piece that's going to be most impactful, though certainly there are other pieces as well. If you're building a model or fine-tuning a model, it could be the frontier evaluations that are potentially most impactful. Again, those aren't explicitly tied to new rules here, but I think the idea is that if those evaluations start to identify national security related risks, those could be mitigated through a number of existing regulatory regimes. Similarly, for data centers, this kind of goes back to, I think, some of the concepts we discussed earlier, particularly in Pillar 2. But if you're a data center and you're thinking about national security, I'd be thinking about different supply chain risks, different both physical and cybersecurity risks and ways that can be mitigated. So it is definitely pretty dependent on kind of where you sit in the overall AI ecosystem. But I do think, as you indicated, Jerome, it is sufficiently broad that kind of regardless of where you are, there's at least something that will likely be impactful for your business or for whatever activities you're doing in the AI space.
One of the interesting challenges in this space, and I want to stay with national security for a moment, Evan, but if you're in this space, whether you're in national security or any other area, if you're dealing with AI, and that's what I mean by in this space, AI in a sense is a double-edged sword in the sense that it clearly can make the world a better place, but it also clearly, if used irresponsibly, for example, terrorists use AI just like people who want peace in the world. There are some government actors who Robert started to talk about. He wants these data centers, either in locations or otherwise, or these data centers exist, which are huge data centers, people who have values similar to his. Robert is a person who's interested in making the world a better place, a very peaceful world where all of us benefit. But there are some people who have very different values than Robert. So what does the action plan indicate in terms of enforcement of existing national security laws? And do you believe there will be more national security laws? Or if you listen to Matt very closely, Matt was taking the position, I think, that there may be some softening of regulations in order to have innovation expand. In the national security space, how is that playing out?
It's a great question. And I would say the phrase that comes to mind when I think about this is kind of the old phrase of politics stops at the water's edge. And I tend to think in this space, it's kind of deregulation stops at the edge of national security in the sense that I completely agree. I think the broad thrust of the action plan is very deregulatory and wanting to remove roadblocks and barriers for industry to kind of run and succeed in this space. But where there are indications that there are likely to be new rules or more robust enforcement of existing rules, I think that tends to be grouped in the national security kind of realm, where there's a lot of discussion about potential enhancements or potential enforcement of existing rules. And export controls is probably a good example of that. There's language in the action plan about wanting to enforce existing rules more robustly and doing that in a few different ways. One, thinking about technology-specific approaches. So are there, for example, ways to embed within some of these advanced GPUs that we're trying to control location tracking technology? So you can see if you thought that the chip was going to Thailand or the Philippines and it's actually in China, for example. So that's one piece of it. There's also language about wanting to expand the role of personnel in the federal government who are worried about export controls enforcement. It's principally enforced by the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is an agency in the Commerce Department, although criminal enforcement is done by the Justice Department. But there's language here about wanting to rely on the intelligence community, for example, and bring in more of the intelligence community capabilities to help augment what's already being done at BIS or at DOJ. There's also some interesting discussion of how we push our allies and partners to adopt controls that are similar to what we have in the United States. And a lot of that is focused through kind of the traditional methods of diplomacy and working cooperatively with those allies and partners. But there's definitely a coercive component in the action plan where it contemplates that if there are jurisdictions that aren't taking necessary measures in the views of the administration, they will consider using tools like tariffs to punish those jurisdictions. Or they will consider additional regulation in the form of something called the foreign direct product rule, which gets into a weedy corner of export controls very quickly, but at a very high level is a way that the Commerce Department can extend jurisdiction to certain items that are produced outside the U.S., where they are created using U.S. technology or software, or certain plants or components that were created using U.S. technology and software. So there's a bunch of different mechanisms there that are contemplated in the action plan. But there is, I think, certainly a desire to enforce the existing rules more robustly, expand the rules in some instances. There's a particular discussion of subsystems for semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and to, again, pressure, coerce, potentially, various other countries into adopting rules that are similar to what we have. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach.
It's interesting. There's a part of the action plan that will cause most of us to pause. In fact, when you talked about this section that I'm going to highlight in a second, you were very careful with your language when you were talking about the action steps in Pillar 3. So the action plan suggests that the U.S. will be actively participating in various international AI bodies. Many of us pause because that doesn't appear to be the preference of the president. the president has typically not been very active or had the administration very active across the board in the various bodies. He has had some concern that he's expressed, and he has gone in directions that are not the directions that many of the international bodies have gone in. So is the president shifting? Is this a shift in the way his preferences are when the focus is AI? Or what's going on here where it's the president's action plan and he is saying that the U.S. will be actively participating in these various international AI bodies?
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece of the action plan. And I think it caught a lot of people by surprise, or at a minimum, it jumped out to a lot of people as being not something that they would have necessarily anticipated would be in there. And I think that's driven both by the administration's general preference, as you were mentioning, Jerome, to engage in either a more bilateral manner or in some cases, just a unilateral manner, and in general, kind of reticence towards some of these various international bodies, both from a kind of broad macro perspective, but then also specifically with AI. And we saw early in the administration, Vice President Vance went to the Paris AI Action Summit and gave a speech that indicated the administration was shifting course away from concepts of AI safety and toward AI growth and opportunity, and then kind of left shortly after making his speech before some of the other world leaders gave their speeches, and the U.S. didn't sign on to the joint communique that came out of that. And so I think a lot of people were of the view that the administration felt these organizations, these international bodies, were creating rules and creating standards that were kind of holding back innovation and going to be harmful to U.S. industry. And I think the administration still does hold that view, but I think they have either come to realize or perhaps realized all along, but are just articulating more clearly now that even though they have this concern about some of these international organizations, if the U.S. is not present in those organizations, that means that leadership vacuum will be filled by somebody else. And the concern, as articulated in the action plan, is that the leadership vacuum will be filled by China in particular. And so the action plan indicates that the U.S. will have an active role in these organizations. It's a little bit unclear, I think, if an active role means they will actually be proposing an American-developed agenda, or if the activity will principally be limited to kind of countering China or countering Chinese proposals. It may be that the latter is more likely, but it's certainly interesting. I think the other point I would make on that is, although the kind of stated intent of being active in these organizations is principally to counter China, some of the organizations that are mentioned, like the G7 or the OECD, China's not actually a participant in. So it's a little bit interesting that those are mentioned as areas where the U.S. intends to engage, even though there wouldn't be kind of a direct avenue, at least for China, to influence those bodies, although certainly there might be various indirect mechanisms. But it is definitely one of the more interesting, and again, I think somewhat maybe surprising pieces of the action plan.
So the next couple of questions will be for all of you. Azish and Robert both alluded to what I want to talk about now, and that is there are at least two narratives when you take into account what President Trump has done, including in his action plan. One narrative says that President Trump had the benefit of watching the outcomes of President Biden's approach to AI. All of us, I think, would agree that President Biden put a lot of emphasis on AI safety. She talked about privacy. She talked about confidentiality. She could have talked about bias. There's a whole range of areas that President Biden was focused on. So again, one narrative would say President Trump looked at what was good and what was not good about President Biden, because some people concluded that while President Biden did focus on those areas, he went too far in a lot of cases, and he stifled innovation. He limited the U.S. competitiveness. Whether you agree with it or not, that narrative is out there. Another narrative that's out there is that, for goodness sake, President Trump, for either political reasons or policy reasons, simply rescinded and revoked what President Biden was doing. And when he did that, he threw the baby out with the bathwater. Rather than clean it up, he just said, forget it. I'm going to throw out everything that President Biden did, and I'm going to have a new approach. Both of those narratives are out there. And so you have stakeholders that are struggling to figure out, did President Trump go too far? Or are we in a phase now where everything is about competition? Everything is about winning the battle. And if there's no safety measures or guardrails in place, that's just what we have to do to get to where we're trying to go. So I'm asking each one of you this question. If you were providing feedback on the president's plan, what would you say the president needs to do to improve the plan? Or would you say, hey, well, maybe it's exactly right. We don't have to worry about the safety issues. The important part is we need to lead right now, because if we don't lead, somebody else will lead. Are we, in your minds, in terms of the action plan? It's actually quite an aggressive action plan for 24 pages. A lot of things have to happen. And as Robert suggested, it's not so easy to just say, okay, fine, we're going to plop down a data center, a huge data center at all these locations. It's not going to be without litigation. It's not going to be without environmental issues. In some cases where he's just saying, hey, wait a second, confidentiality, privacy, bias, all those issues are real issues. You suggested cybersecurity is going to be a major issue. It's not going to be easy because you have state actors. So what would your advice, and Azish, because your name starts with an A, I'm going to ask you first, what would be your advice to President Trump?
Well, fantastic question. And I think about the predominant conversation within the AI space is around the ethics issues. Can I trust it? Should I fear it long term? What are ways that I can integrate it without it making mistakes in the enterprise systems that I have? These are all essentially AI ethics issues that have impeded the development of the technology. And what I would have liked to see more of in the action plan is how to address this fear in a way that includes all of the stakeholders so that we can run faster with it. One of the analogies I like from the engineering space is that cars can go fast because they have brakes. If we didn't have brakes on cars, we wouldn't drive as fast as we do, right? So I think about the same concept when it comes to AI technology, because people start from a place of fear. And when I say people, I include the citizens in the civil society sector of it, but also in industry, right? So there is this concern that regulation might shift and they want to make sure that they're building correctly for the long term, but also not being able to trust the output of the technology is a challenge for building for the long term. There are some aspects of the action plan that I think do a really good job to hit the nail on the head when it comes to this challenge. And I talked about some of those in Pillar 1 relating to testing and setting some standards. But what I think one of the biggest missing pieces is that Bill of Rights approach, right? The rights-based framework from a citizen's perspective as it relates to how is this technology going to affect me and what recourse do I have? especially when things like transparency are missing or data privacy and protection are missing. Our current legal infrastructure then doesn't give you a clear pathway to be able to assert your rights. So how do we protect people as these technologies are becoming more consumer facing? So I think that's the one piece of it that's going to then push it into the courts, and then it's going to slow things down. If we were able to have an infrastructure and set up at the beginning that allowed industries to think about these concepts critically with principles that I think were embedded in the Biden administration's Bill of Rights. And the other thing I'll say about this, Jerome, is that as I think about Pillar 2 and those infrastructure needs, those are true competitiveness concerns from an international perspective. In the best case scenario, the existing administrative infrastructure at the local level that allowed for considerations relating to land use or water rights, those have been hard-won battles that have now created pathways for people to have a forum to be able to debate them. So how we are going to go around those in order to set up data centers, we're already seeing in Virginia, where I'm based now, there has been a lot of backlash and a lot of criticism around the locations of these data centers because some of these fundamental issues in terms of who's going to pay for the upgraded grid. How is that going to impact all of our electricity bills? Those are fundamental issues that need to be worked out through the political system, that if we could think about ex ante and set up a system that doesn't just wave away the existing infrastructure, I think could help us run faster in the long term.
Evan, what would you say to President Trump in terms of how he might improve on the action plan?
Well, I think as with many things, it matters a lot how this is implemented. And so the devil is going to be in the details in significant part. One thing I was thinking as you were talking to him is that I do think there's a little bit more continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations than perhaps folks realize or state publicly. In thinking through this document, for example, AI safety does not appear, but there's a whole lot of concepts related to AI safety, like interpretability and control and understanding emergent properties of AI models that all kind of come from that AI safety research lane. Now, obviously, it doesn't bring in everything that folks can put into that category, but it certainly brings in a lot of the concepts. And so I do think to some degree, there's a lot that's being carried forward by, even if it's repackaged a little bit differently or being motivated by a somewhat different set of priorities. So I think that's one thing. The other thought I have here is just that I think the right answers to a lot of these questions, in particular the questions from kind of the international and national security framework, depend in significant part on the trajectory of the technology. And that's a question that I think nobody quite knows, but I think the answers of what we need to do look very different if you're of the view that it is likely or very likely that we will have artificial superintelligence in 2027 or maybe even 2030, than if you're of the view that we're not going to get there for another 10 or 20 plus years. If it's likely that's really on the short-term horizon, I think the policy prescriptions look a little bit different. And I think it may justify taking a little bit more of a forward-leaning approach, wanting to make sure that indeed it is the United States that is the first to have that technology. But again, I think there's no consensus answer to that. I think most folks from industry are of the view that we may get there in the next 2, 3, 5 years, but there are certainly folks who take different views on that as well. But I think that is an essential question and an unanswered question. And so I guess in terms of advice for folks making policy here, I would just say that I think it's important to be nimble so that we can adjust based on where the technology goes. And if the technology is speeding up, we may need to adjust one way. If things are slowing down, there may be a possibility to adjust another way. But I think being able to adjust course based on where the technology goes is going to be critical.
Robert, what advice would you provide to President Trump in terms of improving the action plan?
Yeah, so I generally agree with what Evan just said, that it's not that this action plan doesn't have anything about safety in it, right? At the same time, I think it's worth emphasizing that like safety and ethics are not un-American, nor are they in tension with innovation always, right? And so I understand the desire to move quickly. And I think that I'm sure that there's a lot of red tape out there that will make it hard for us to move quickly on this. And we probably need to push that aside. That is not the safety that people have generally talked about when it comes to AI, not kind of on the infrastructure side, but on the deployment side. And one of the topics that, for example, I've written a lot about and that concerns me is this idea of AI addiction and AI companionship. And we've seen more and more fairly horrific stories, not just of children, but also of adults who have ended up in these really problematic relationships with AI and harm has come to them. And I don't see much utility in that. I see a lot of utility in AI companionship at large, but I don't see a lot of utility in AI addiction, nor do I see any reason why trying to provide safety along those lines should be in tension with other goals that President Trump or his administration might have. And so to your point about the baby and the bathwater, I just don't think that it's an either or choice. And maybe this kind of like naivete will be beaten out of me at some point, but I think that a lot of the safety issues here don't seem partisan at all. Some do, certainly, but a lot of them are about making sure that America is healthy and productive and that our values aren't corrupted and things like that. That seems like kind of basic things we can all agree on. I understand the details get messy, right? And when we're talking about the biases embedded in these models, it's more complicated. But some of the high level safety considerations seem like they are just a prerequisite for the widespread usage of this technology, and so ought to be emphasized. That being said, I don't think that they're not there at all, right? Like if you look at some of the cybersecurity stuff that's in there, I think you can kind of make that leap. It would probably be nice to see it more explicit. And then, of course, in addition to removing red tape, we also need to create resources. And sitting in a university right now, I can tell you that this is a challenging time for research, including research in AI. And so kind of maybe in an effort to practice what one preaches, it would be good to see resources that are dedicated to research on the critical infrastructure side, on the AI side, on all of these things. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. So I want to thank Robert, Evan, and Matt for the excellent job that you've done in explaining the AI action plan, the implications of the plan, and even providing advice not only to market participants and stakeholders, but to President Trump himself. Excellent job. We look forward to your participation in the next podcast hosted by the task force. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen and Jalen Martin.